Hello, I'm children's wellbeing consultant Julia Hankins, and I'm also the founder of Wellbeing Adventurers. And I deliver workshops and trainings, mostly in schools, to children and trained teachers. And I also train other kids yoga teachers and mentor them too. And today I'd like to talk about assumptions and making assumptions. And this is something that is really, um, quite important to me. Actually, is one of my business's brand pillars is safety, or like core values. Sorry, is probably a better term. One of my core values as a person and also my business is safety. And this is something, assumptions is something that I think makes people feel really unsafe. And it's something that is, yeah, it's quite a triggering thing for me, because some of my family are quite often affected by people's assumptions, and so within my family I have a few people whose gender is different to the gender that they were assigned at birth, and this can be problematic for them, especially when people make assumptions. And so I wanted to talk about that today. And then I actually got thinking about other assumptions too. So firstly, I'm going to talk about gender and gender assumptions, and then I'm going to move on to some other ones. And so these are, for me, things that I think that it's really important for us to consider when we're working with children, or working with any human, really, just human things. So the first thing is, don't make assumptions about people's gender based upon how they look or how they act, the clothes they wear, the clothes they wear, or the way that they present. Because the only way that you will know somebody's gender is if they tell you themselves. That's the only way you'll know somebody's gender and their pronouns of how they wish to be called. And so our, our life conditioning, our experiences, the way that we've been brought up really heavily influences the assumptions that we make and about people and the way that they seem to us. And so when we make these wrong assumptions, it can be very upsetting for the people who we have made the assumptions about. And so try to consider within your classes using phrases that are gender neutral. And this is just a much fairer, kinder, more considered, more intentional way of dealing with people. And so the words that I use are, I would say, the child, or the pupil, or the child wearing such and such, or I would use they and them rather than she or he, because you're never going to get it wrong with they or them. That's going to be okay for whether a person identifies as male, female, non-binary, trans, whatever. And so I try to use gender neutral pronouns and gender neutral phrases throughout my classes. And so, for example, if I was to show some postcards, here's one of the postcards that I may be using, and instead of saying the boy or the girl, I would say the child wearing the blue top and the yellow trousers. Or I may say our yoga friend over here who's doing this. So I may use phrases like, yeah, our yoga friend, or the child, or the kid in this clothes. I'm just very considerate about the language that I use around gender. But there are other assumptions that I think it's really important to avoid making. And so I've just written them down, and I'm going to refer to my little checklist. So another one that I've seen other people assume is family structure and emotional support from families, just general assumptions that people make about people's families. And so this is particularly important if you don't know the children's family situation. I mean, you may, oh, sorry, that's my little alarm. Freaked me out then. Do you know what? I'm not going to re-record this. I'm just going to accept that happened and just move on. So apologies if you were listening and you just suddenly had a big beep in your ear and you were like, what happened? Yeah, so especially if you're teaching children and you don't really know their current situation, it's really important for you to not assume. So don't assume that every family has a dad and a mom, because, well, firstly, that's very heteronormative. That's very assuming that everybody has a dad and a mom, is assuming that everybody's heterosexual, and that's just not the case. So, families are made up of lots of things. Families are made of two dads or two moms, or just one mom or just one dad, or it may not even be their dad or their mom. Don't assume that people live with their parents, or even that they have parents, because the people in your classes, the children in your classes, may not. They may not have a dad or a mom, or they may have a difficult relationship with that person, and they may live with a relative or in an adoptive family, or they may be fostered. You just don't know. And so being really considerate around the language that you use to do with families, I feel, is really, really important at making people in my classes really feel safe. And so that looks like saying things like, when you get home, you could teach or show this to the people in your home. So people in your home just doesn't assume anything, because the people in their home may not be family. People in their home may not be relatives at all, but they probably all do have somewhere where they live that they consider their home. It's also important, I think, that you don't assume that the child feels loved by or supported or feels safe with their parents, because sadly not all children do. Obviously we would love a world where children did feel that, but not all children do. And so in a relaxing story, for example, I wouldn't necessarily, unless I really, really knew the children and knew this was the case, I wouldn't say something like, imagine having a big hug from your mom or your dad or anything like that. I wouldn't say that. I might say something like, imagine being with someone who makes you feel safe and loved. Because most children, well, I would hope that all children have someone who makes them feel loved, or at the very least makes them feel safe. And again, not assuming that all children would want to be touched by somebody in their family, or necessarily hugged by someone in their family. And this is really sad, isn't it? Because, we would want everybody to feel like they had someone in their family who was going to give them a cuddle and make them feel loved, but that's just not the case for all. So yeah, be careful around your assumptions around families, and consider using phrases such as your grown-ups, or the adult who cares for you, or your loved ones, something like that. So I also think it's important not to make assumptions based around your own cultural or religious background, and assuming that for other people too. And I see this a lot actually in schools, where people make assumptions and comments, and it's just not appropriate. Talking about Easter or Christmas, or assuming that children celebrate the same holidays or religious festivals. This is particularly, I think this is probably true in all of your classes actually. Don't assume that all children will celebrate the same festivals that you celebrate. I avoid themes related to religion, partly because I'm not religious myself, but also because I recognise that in my classes there's a huge range of diverse children, and their cultural backgrounds are very rich, and so they're likely to celebrate very different festivals and very different holidays. And so I don't tend to theme around things like that. I'm not saying you shouldn't theme around things like that, but just being aware that there may be children in your classes that have different experiences. And so it's not that you have to like never talk about it, but just be aware of it. And so being aware of the fact that other children may have cultural backgrounds that impact in the way that they can participate in some of your elements of your lesson too. And so be aware that some children may I'm not even going to list something that may happen, because I can't think of the spot. but there may be something that children can't join in because of their beliefs, because of their religious beliefs. And so if this is something that you have experienced and you need support with, I do actually have a yoga and religion letter that is in my document bundle, and that's something that I share with people who are concerned about yoga being opposed to religion. So if that's something you might find useful, check out my document bundle, it's in there. Another thing that I think it's important not to assume is the children's use of language, communication, and their learning style. Don't assume that children will understand you right away. In fact, I had this situation on Friday, and I feel really awful about it. There was a child I hadn't been told. Normally, I'm told. This was in a teaching in a classroom situation or a school situation. I was in the hall, and there was a child who was new to the school and they didn't have any English. And usually I'm warned, like, oh, this child doesn't have any English, they're new to the school. But nobody told me that because it was a supply teacher who would come in, and I don't think she was aware of it herself. And I repeated myself for a number of times before I realised she was not understanding what I was saying. And so don't assume that children understand what you're saying, and don't assume that they're ignoring you because they're being rude. Sometimes they don't understand you for a variety of reasons. So it could be that they have English as an additional language. It could be that they have speech and language difficulties or some other learning need. It could be that they have experienced trauma, and so that is impacting on the way that they're communicating. It could be that they have confidence issues or mental health issues that are impacting in the way that they relate to people. And so there's lots of reasons why children may not understand you or communicate with you in the way that you maybe are expecting, or they may be learning in a different way too. And so the way that I deal with this is having lots of visual aids to support me. So this is where these cards are so handy for me, because even if a child doesn't understand the words that I'm saying, I can point to different things and talk and show them on their, on my body. I wouldn't touch them, but show them examples. So lots of visual aids, maybe using lots of gestures like, yeah, that's really good. I do that so much, the double thumbs. Speaking slower and using less words and more simple language is something that I try to use when I realise that somebody's not understanding what I'm saying. But also try to avoid assuming that children will learn in the same way. I tend to expect that I'll need to show something or demonstrate something, or I'll need to explicitly demonstrate something. So I will expect to give an instruction in a variety of different ways, because children will learn in different ways too. Another assumption that I think we should avoid in our kids yoga classes is the physical and neurological ability of the children who we're teaching. So don't assume that all children can stand still or balance or follow steps, especially if they're multi-step. And not all children will be able to sit still or concentrate on what you're saying without fidgeting. And try to avoid thinking that somebody sitting still is really focusing, because that's just not the case. I always give options of movement in my classes, and in fact the reason why I include props in my classes, and usually one each, is so that children do have something that they can hold and touch and squeeze, because fidgeting helps many people engage with what's being said. So don't assume that if a child is fidgeting that they're being rude and they're being distracted. It may be their brain's way of keeping them concentrating on what you're saying. And also don't assume that somebody's sitting still, therefore they're focusing, because they may be daydreaming and not at all listening to what you're saying. So be open to the fact that children engage in different ways, and be prepared for that within your classes. And the last assumption that I try to avoid in my own classes is economic situations. And this is particularly important in classes delivered in schools where you're teaching a real range of children where they haven't had to pay for the session. So this is likely to be less of an issue in your paid classes and workshops, perhaps. But don't assume that all children have the same experiences that you have had, or that your children have had, or that the other children in the group have had. So, and I made assumptions there, didn't I? Because I assumed that you will have various economic privileges, but that may not be the case for you, and it may not be the case for your family either. So don't assume that the children have gone on holidays. So if you've been away for a while and you've come back, don't be like, oh, where did you go on holiday? Because not all children will have had a holiday. Don't assume gifts. What did you have for Christmas? Or what did you have for your birthday? Or what did you have for Eid? Not all children will be able to have gifts. And if they are, they may be embarrassed about what they had. And that may lead them into lying. Which can happen, and then they may feel guilty about the fact that they've lied, and that can happen too. So don't assume that they've got tech at home. Not all children have, and even not all children even have had breakfast that day. So try to avoid assuming an economic situation. So yeah, I would avoid talking about gifts and things like that, and I would avoid talking about holidays because not all children will have experienced them. But obviously, if somebody brings up that, you can talk about it. I'm not saying don't ever talk about it, but instead of saying something like, "Oh, imagine somewhere you've been on holiday," you could get the children to imagine or think about a place where they've been and they felt peaceful, because not all children will have been necessarily to the beach or to a field or something like that, but all children will hopefully have experienced a feeling of peace at some point in their life, we hope. So that was quite a long one, and I feel like I've kind of stood on a soapbox giving a whole load of blah, 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 blah. But this is just my experience of teaching many children from many different cultural backgrounds, from many different economic situations, and many different family structures and gender identities. And I think also, there's things like bodies. Don't assume that if somebody's larger, don't assume that they're unfit. I just think check your assumptions, any assumptions that you're making. And I think, I include myself in this. I am certainly not, without my own assumptions. But I think it's really healthy for us and really responsible of us to think about our own assumptions that we're making and consider whether they are, the right things, whether we're right even. Okay, so that's all I've got on this for today. And so I hope you found that video interesting, useful, thought-provoking. I'd love to know your thoughts on it, and let me know in the comments what you think.